close your eyes now, and imagine with me a world where time bent just once, where history folded at a single point and never unfolded the same way again. It is January 1965, a cold and grey London morning, and an old man lies in his bed at Hyde Park Gate, his body worn by 90 years of cigars and champagne, of war rooms and parliamentary battles, of paintings half finished and speeches that shook the world to its foundations. The doctors wait in hushed conference outside his door. The family gathers in the sitting room below, their faces drawn with the anticipation of grief. The nation holds its breath, newspapers already preparing their obituaries, their full-page tributes, their retrospectives on a life that defined an era. But Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill does not die. His heart, that stubborn engine that powered him through the trenches of the Somme and the blitzes of London, through defeat in Gallipoli and victory over the Nazis, through the darkest hours humanity has ever known, simply refuses to stop beating. The moment of crisis passes like a wave retreating from the shore. His breathing steadies. His pulse strengthens. The doctors exchange bewildered glances, checking monitors and charts, finding no medical explanation for this reversal. And he opens his eyes to a world that expected to mourn him, a Britain that had prepared to lower its flags and observe its moment of solemn silence, but must now reckon with him still breathing, still thinking, still remembering everything he has done and everything he has seen across nearly a century of existence. This is not the story of how he lived those first 90 years, but of how he kept living, decade folding into decade, century bleeding into century, watching the world he saved from fascism transform into something he could never have imagined in his most visionary moments, carrying within him the weight of choices made in smoke-filled rooms when the fate of civilization itself hung by the thinnest thread. Let us walk together now through this long impossible twilight, this unprecedented extension of one man's journey through time, and see what becomes of a legend who refuses to become history, who continues existing even as the world around him evolves beyond all recognition. The 1960s unfold around him like a strange new chapter in a book he thought had reached its final page. Churchill recovers slowly from that January crisis, against all medical expectation and probability, his constitution proving as resilient as his political will once was in the face of Hitler's armies. He sits in his study at Chartwell, the Kentish estate he purchased decades ago and loved with a passion he rarely showed for anything outside of politics and family, watching television broadcasts of a world growing louder, faster, more colourful and chaotic than the sepia-toned empire of his youth. The Beatles appear on screens across Britain and then across the world, and he listens with bemused tolerance to music that bears no resemblance whatsoever to the military marches and classical compositions of his era, to the structured harmonies and dignified melodies that defined his generation's relationship with sound. Young people march in the streets of London and Paris and Berkeley, their hair long and unkempt by his standards, their messages about peace and love and ending war forever ringing through cities that still bear the scars of the last great conflict. And he remembers other marches, other cries for change, other moments when the young believed with absolute certainty that they could remake the world according to their ideals. He does not judge them harshly, these children who never knew the terror of invasion, never felt the ground shake from falling bombs, never understood what it meant to stand truly alone against existential darkness. He has seen too much, lived too long, experienced too many reversals of fortune to judge harshly anymore. His paintings continue in these years, slow, careful brushstrokes on canvas, landscapes of the Mediterranean coasts where he vacationed between political crises, trying to capture the quality of light the way he once tried to capture the fleeting moment of military victory. Friends from the war years visit less frequently now. Some have already passed into genuine death. Others are fading quickly, succumbing to age and illness, and he finds himself increasingly alone, the last man standing from so many crucial meetings, so many desperate midnight hours when the future hung in balance. Montgomery comes to see him once, old and frail himself now, moving with difficulty, and they sit in Churchill's study in silence mostly, two ancient warriors with nothing left to prove to each other or the world, their shared memories needing no words. Churchill's mind drifts often during these years to 1940, to that terrible summer when France fell and Britain stood utterly alone against the Nazi war machine, when his voice crackling over the radio was quite literally the only thing standing between Western civilization and the abyss of totalitarian darkness. He remembers the weight of those moments, the crushing responsibility of knowing that his words, his decisions, his ability to inspire confidence in a desperate population would determine whether democracy survived in Europe or perished completely. Sometimes at night he wakes from dreams of those days, his heart racing, and for a moment he is back in the cabinet war rooms, receiving reports of shipping losses in the Atlantic, of cities burning, of young men dying in the skies over England. The vividness of these memories never fades. If anything, they grow sharper as other things begin to blur, as if his mind is hoarding what it considers most essential while releasing the mundane details of more recent years. The 1970s arrive with oil crises and economic turmoil that seem trivial compared to the existential threats he navigated, and Churchill watches from his chair as the empire he once administered, the vast British territories that covered a quarter of the globe and ruled over hundreds of millions of souls, continues its slow dissolution into history. India achieved independence in 1947. Of course, that happened before his supposed death, Clement Attlee's Labour government granting freedom to the jewel in the crown, though Churchill had resisted with every fibre of his being, believing it premature, fearing the bloodshed that would follow. And bloodshed there was, partition creating wounds that still bleed decades later. But India endures as the world's largest democracy, and he cannot decide if this vindicates Attlee's decision or confirms his own warnings. Now African nations declare independence one after another in rapid succession, the map of pink British territories shrinking year by year like ice melting in the sun, and he feels a complex mixture of emotions he cannot quite name or separate from each other. Pride, perhaps, that British values of parliamentary democracy and rule of law have spread across the globe, taking root in places that knew neither before the British arrived. Melancholy certainly, that the structure which spread those values, the empire he served with distinction across continents and decades, is crumbling into the past. And understanding, finally, grudging and painful but real, understanding that history moves in one direction only and that empire is a word from another age, that the future belongs to sovereign nations and self-determination, not to colonial administration however benevolent it might imagine itself to be. He is interviewed occasionally during these years by young journalists who treat him like a museum piece, a living artifact from an incomprehensibly distant past, asking carefully worded questions about decisions made 30 or 40 years prior as if inquiring about ancient history. Did you know? One asks with the confidence of someone who has never made a decision that cost lives. that the bombing of Dresden would become so controversial. And Churchill looks at this young man with eyes that have seen things no camera ever captured, horrors and glories beyond the imagination of anyone born into peace and prosperity, and says quietly, with the patience of extreme age, "War itself is controversial, young man. Victory is necessary. I chose necessity over comfort, results over popularity. I would make the same choices again." His hands shake now when he lights his cigars, the tremor of age making the simple act difficult. But he still lights them daily, still defies his doctors who warn about his lungs and his heart, still insists on his champagne at dinner as he has for decades. These small rebellions are all that remain of the defiant spirit that once directed armies and shaped the fate of nations. The past is so vivid to him now, more vivid and immediate than the present, which often seems dreamlike and unreal. He can smell the acrid smoke of London burning during the Blitz, can hear the air raid sirens wailing across the city, can feel the exact texture of the paper on which he wrote his speeches in the small hours of the morning, finding the words that would sustain Britain through another day of war. He remembers the faces of young pilots who came to brief him and were dead within a week, shot down over the Channel or the fields of France. He remembers the awful calculations of acceptable losses, the decisions about which cities to defend and which to sacrifice, which convoys to protect and which to let sail into danger. These memories do not fade or soften with time. They remain sharp and cutting, diamonds of experience that he carries always. By 1980, Winston Churchill has become something unprecedented in human history, a living bridge spanning from the Victorian era to the computer age, from horse-drawn carriages to space shuttles, from gas lamps to nuclear power. He is 105 years old, his face a landscape of deep wrinkles and age spots, his voice a whisper of its former thunder that once filled the House of Commons and echoed from radio speakers across the globe. But his mind remains sharp in unexpected moments, cutting through the fog of age with sudden clarity that startles everyone around him. The Cold War that he himself named in his famous Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Missouri continues to define global politics, and he watches with grim satisfaction and deep concern as the tension between East and West shapes everything from weapons development to Olympic competitions, just as he predicted it would when others still hoped for lasting cooperation with Stalin's Soviet Union. Reagan rises to power in America, this former actor turned politician, and Thatcher claims 10 Downing Street in Britain, and Margaret Thatcher visits Churchill personally at Chartwell, this woman who leads his beloved Conservative Party into a new era, and he takes her hand with trembling fingers that once signed declarations of war and peace treaties, and tells her with what force he can muster, "You must be strong with them, Margaret. They only understand strength, never mistake there. Smiles for friendship, never confuse negotiation with appeasement." She listens intently, this iron lady meeting the man who was iron and steel before those metaphors became fashionable, and something passes between them in that quiet room. Some understanding of what it means to stand firm when the entire world demands compromise and accommodation. What it costs personally to pursue what you believe is right regardless of popularity or criticism. Churchill's memories of Stalin come flooding back during these visits and after. Those meetings at Yalta and Potsdam where he sat across the table from the Soviet dictator, smiling and toasting while measuring the man's ruthlessness with every instinct honed over decades of political combat. knowing even then with absolute certainty that the alliance born of necessity against Hitler would dissolve the moment their common enemy was defeated, that the war's end would birth a new and different conflict, potentially even more dangerous than the one just concluded. He told Roosevelt this, told him repeatedly not to trust Stalin too far, not to believe that shared victory would create lasting friendship between systems so fundamentally opposed. But Roosevelt was ill and idealistic and believed deeply in the possibility of lasting cooperation between the great powers. Churchill knew better. He had always known better about tyrants and dictators, had studied their methods and psychology, had understood that totalitarian regimes by their nature cannot coexist peacefully with free societies. The strangest gift and curse of his impossible longevity is watching his own reputation rise and fall and rise again like tides beyond his control, moved by currents of historical interpretation and contemporary politics that he can observe but no longer influence. In the 1980s, academic historians begin reassessing his record with new critical eyes, questioning decisions about India and its path to independence, about the Bengal famine of 1943 and his response to it, about choices made in colonial administration decades before the Second World War, when he held various cabinet positions. Books appear with provocative titles that would have enraged him in his prime, and now he simply reads them when his eyes permit, when someone reads passages aloud to him, seeing his life dissected and judged by people who were not there in those moments, who did not face the impossible choices between bad options and worse ones, who judge from the comfort of hindsight and the safety of peace that his generation purchased with blood. He wants to respond, to defend himself against accusations of racism and imperialism, to explain the context of his times and the constraints under which he operated. But his voice is too weak now for speeches and his hands too unsteady for writing, and the world has moved on to new arguments, new battles, new controversies that have nothing to do with Winston Churchill. His grandson reads him some of the harsher critiques one afternoon, and Churchill listens with eyes closed, his breathing steady, and says finally in a voice barely above a whisper, "I did what I believed was right with the information I possessed at the time and the values I was raised to honor. History will judge me as it judges everyone, and I cannot control history's verdict. I could only ever control my own actions, and I took the actions I thought necessary." It is as close to peace as he has ever come with his own legacy, this understanding that he cannot shape how future generations will view him, cannot ensure that his intentions are understood or his context appreciated. The paintings continue in these years, though his hand can barely hold the brush anymore and nurses must help position the canvas and mix the paints. He paints the same scenes over and over, the sea at Marrakesh where he vacationed, the gardens at Chartwell in spring, the sun setting over landscapes that exist now only in his memory and on these canvases. He painted during the war to keep his sanity, to give his mind rest from the endless calculations of death and strategy, and he paints now for the same reason fundamentally, to escape the weight of being Winston Churchill, to exist for a few moments as simply a man with a brush trying to capture beauty before it fades. November 1989 arrives, and the Berlin Wall falls on television screens across the world, and Churchill watches this barrier that symbolized everything he warned about for 40 years crumbling under the hammers and pickaxes of German citizens who have lived their entire lives in division, who are tearing down the physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain he named. Tears run down his ancient face, cutting tracks through wrinkles, and his nurse asks with concern if he is in pain. if something is wrong, and he shakes his head slowly, unable to speak for several minutes, overwhelmed by the vindication and the waste of it all, the tragic unnecessary waste of 44 years. 44 years that wall stood like a tombstone marking the death of a unified Germany. 44 years of families separated by concrete and barbed wire and armed guards, of a great city torn in half by ideology, of a continent divided between freedom and tyranny, between democracy and dictatorship, exactly as he said it would be in that speech in Fulton, Missouri, in March of 1946, when the ashes of the Second World War were still warm. He was mocked for that speech at the time, called a warmonger and worse, accused of destroying the alliance with Stalin unnecessarily, of creating tensions that need not exist if only everyone would be reasonable and trusting. But he was right, and now the proof broadcasts across every television screen in the world. Crowds of Germans dancing on the wall, celebrating freedom, reuniting with family members they have not touched in decades. The Soviet Union itself is collapsing like a building whose foundation has rotted away. The communist ideology that killed tens of millions of people through purges and famines and gulags is finally dying, and Winston Churchill has lived long enough to see it, to witness the end of the Cold War he predicted and helped the West prepare for. We won, he whispers to himself in the darkness of his room that night, tears still wet on his face. We won both wars. The first against Hitler's fascism and racial madness, the second against Stalin's communism and totalitarian control. And though the Second War was cold and long and fought with different weapons of economics and espionage and proxy conflicts, it was no less real, no less essential to the survival of human freedom. His role in that second victory was smaller than in the first, certainly advisory and symbolic more than operational, the guidance of an elder statesman rather than the direction of a wartime leader. But his warnings shaped how the West understood the Soviet threat, how democratic nations prepared themselves for the long twilight struggle that lasted his entire post-war life and beyond. He thinks often during these days of Roosevelt, dead since April 1945, never knowing how the post-war world would develop, never seeing how right Churchill was about Stalin's intentions and the Soviet Union's fundamental hostility to Western democracy. He thinks of the millions who died under Soviet rule in the decades after the war, the populations imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain, the dissidents sent to gulags, the famines in Ukraine and China, the purges and the executions. Could any of it have been prevented if Roosevelt had listened? If the West had taken a firmer line in 1945 when American military power was at its height? The question haunts him, unanswerable but persistent. The 1990s bring technologies that seem like magic to a man born in 1874 when Disraeli was Prime Minister and Victoria had ruled for 37 years already. Churchill is 120 years old now, an impossibility, a medical miracle that doctors study with fascination and bewilderment, writing papers about his case that speculate about genetic factors and cellular regeneration and protective mechanisms that medical science does not yet understand. He has outlived everyone he ever knew as a peer or contemporary, outlived all his enemies and all his allies, his critics and his supporters, the people who loved him and the people who despised him. The world speaks to itself through something called the Internet, and his great-grandchildren try patiently to explain it to him. This network of computers connected across the globe sharing information instantaneously. But the concept is too alien, too far removed from telegrams and telephone calls and hand-delivered messages sealed in envelopes. He nods and smiles with the politeness of age and understands nothing of the technology, though he grasps dimly that communication has been revolutionized in ways that would have changed warfare and politics fundamentally had such things existed in his time. What he does understand, what troubles him deeply in his moments of clarity, is that Britain is changing in ways that seem to threaten its very identity as he knew it. The European Union grows stronger and more integrated, binding nations together in economic and political union, diluting sovereignty in ways that alarm him profoundly. He who fought so desperately to keep Britain independent, to keep British decisions in British hands, to resist subordination to any continental power whether led by Napoleon or Hitler, watches with dismay as his country integrates itself voluntarily into a European system that constrains its freedom of action. He mentions once in a rare interview, his voice weak but his conviction evident, that he did not fight 2 world wars to see Britain become a province of Europe, and the comment sparks immediate controversy, arguments in newspapers and on television about his age and his relevance, and whether anyone should listen to a man whose formative experiences occurred in the Victorian era. But some people do listen, and his words, even whispered and weak, carry weight that surprises everyone including himself, because he is Churchill still, because his name resonates across generations, because what he says matters even when people disagree with it. The Queen visits him on his 120th birthday, Elizabeth II, who has reigned for 43 years now, longer than most nations have existed, and they sit together in his room at Chartwell, these 2 symbols of British continuity and tradition, and barely speak because what is there to say that their presence together does not already communicate? She is his sovereign and he is her subject, but they are also 2 people who have devoted their lives to Britain in different ways, who have endured and persisted while everything around them changed, and the understanding between them needs no words. The new millennium arrives like a wave breaking over the world, and Winston Churchill witnesses the year 2000 from a hospital bed in London, his body finally failing in earnest though still refusing to die completely. He is 125 years old, an age so extreme that it seems like a mistake, like reality has forgotten to correct an error. The world celebrates the future with fireworks and parties and optimistic pronouncements about the century ahead, while he embodies the past more completely than any museum artifact or historical document ever could. His mind fades in and out now with increasing frequency, moments of clarity like islands in a sea of confusion, separated by hours where he does not know where he is or what year it is or who these people are attending him. Sometimes he thinks he is back in the war years, calling for reports from the front lines, demanding updates on the bombing campaign over Germany, issuing orders to ministers and generals. His nurses have learned to play along gently with these episodes, to confirm that yes, the reports are coming. Yes, the bombers are ready. Yes, the cabinet will meet in the morning. He issues orders to people long dead, coordinates defenses against enemies long defeated, fights battles that ended half a century ago. But in his clear moments, which still come occasionally like gifts, he asks about the world, and they tell him carefully about things he can barely comprehend or contextualize. Cloning of animals achieved, the internet connecting billions of people in real-time communication, China rising as an economic power to rival America, the Middle East in perpetual conflict over oil and religion and borders drawn by colonial powers including Britain itself. He listens and processes what he can with a mind that once directed an empire but now struggles with the present tense. And sometimes he says things that startle everyone with their insight despite his age and confusion. Terror is the weapon of the weak, he murmurs once during a discussion of modern conflicts. And the weak are often the most dangerous in their way, because they have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. It is pure Churchill, distilled from decades of understanding human nature and the psychology of conflict, emerging from the fog of age like a beacon briefly visible. September 11th, 2001, happens, and his caregivers debate whether to tell him, whether exposing him to such horror serves any purpose. But he sees it on the television before they can decide, watches the towers fall in lower Manhattan in real time like the rest of the world, and his face goes very still, his eyes focused in a way they have not been for months. Again, he whispers, his voice carrying the weight of every war he has known. Again we must fight, again the darkness comes in new forms. He understands instinctively what this means despite his age and confusion, understands that this is a new kind of war against a new kind of enemy, and he asks with sudden urgency to send a message to the American president, to the British Prime Minister, to warn them and guide them and share what he knows about fighting enemies who do not wear uniforms or respect conventions. But his words come out confused and scattered, his thoughts too fragmented to form coherent advice, and the message never gets sent, and he weeps with frustration at his inability to help, to contribute, to matter in this moment of crisis as he mattered so much in previous moments when the world needed him. The Iraq War begins in 2003, another war in Mesopotamia where Churchill himself made decisions and drew borders nearly a century before, and he is 128 years old now, his opinions sought by a few journalists and historians who remember that he too once grappled with Iraq, that he served as colonial secretary after the First World War, and tried to impose order on tribal regions that resisted order then as they resist it now. He is too ill to give proper interviews anymore, too confused to answer questions coherently. But his earlier writings on the subject are republished and widely read, and people are startled by how relevant they remain, how clearly he understood even in the 1920s that the Middle East would be a source of conflict for generations to come. He predicted it explicitly in memoranda and speeches, warning that the artificial nations created from the Ottoman Empire's corpse would struggle to cohere, that religious and ethnic divisions would tear at any imposed unity, that Western powers should be cautious about assuming they could remake ancient societies according to modern blueprints. No one listened then, and the cycle continues now with different actors and different weapons but the same fundamental dynamics, and he lies in his bed dimly aware that some problems have no solutions, only management, only the grim work of preventing worst outcomes rather than achieving best ones. His family keeps vigil now around the clock, knowing surely that the end must come soon, that no constitution, no matter how strong, can endure forever, that biology has limits even when those limits keep expanding beyond anything reasonable. But days turn to weeks, turn to months, turn to years, and still he breathes, still his heart beats its slow rhythm, as if life itself has forgotten how to let him go, as if death cannot figure out how to claim someone who has evaded it so many times already. He dreams often and deeply of Clementine, his wife who died in 1977 after 65 years of marriage, who loved him and endured him and supported him through everything, who put up with his moods and his absences and his impossible demands, who was his anchor and his comfort and his greatest blessing. In his dreams they are young again, walking through gardens in summer, and she is telling him something important, something he needs to know, but he can never quite hear the words, can never quite understand what she is trying to tell him before the dream fades. By 2010, Winston Churchill has become a myth who happens to still be breathing, a legend who refuses to end, a story that continues past its natural conclusion. He is 135 years old, and the world has changed so completely that almost nothing remains of the one he was born into except perhaps the geography of Britain itself, and even that has been altered by motorways and airports and developments that cover what used to be countryside. The British Empire that ruled a quarter of the earth is now a collection of memories, and the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations. The Soviet Union that he warned against and opposed is now history, fractured into Russia and 14 other countries. The great wars of the 20th century that defined his life and career are studied by school children who cannot truly imagine such slaughter, such sacrifice, such existential stakes. He lies in a private room in a medical facility designed specifically for his care, attended by staff who were born long after his supposed death in 1965, who know him only as the patient in room 7 who requires constant monitoring, not as the man who rallied the free world against fascism. Sometimes visitors come still, historians working on books about the war years, filmmakers researching documentaries about his life, and people who simply want to be near someone who shook hands with Queen Victoria as a young cavalry officer, who fought in colonial wars before the invention of the airplane, who stood against Hitler when Hitler seemed invincible, who shaped the modern world in ways both celebrated and condemned depending on who is doing the judging. He cannot speak anymore by this point, his vocal cords having finally given out after more than a century of use, cannot move anything except his eyes occasionally, can only lie still and listen if he is still capable of listening, if his mind still processes the sounds that his ears receive. They read to him sometimes from his own books, from the histories he wrote about both world wars, from the memoirs he penned about his early life, from the speeches he gave that defined moments in human history. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. Someone reads in a steady voice, and tears leak from his closed eyes because somewhere deep inside he remembers the desperation of that moment in 1940, remembers believing they might actually lose everything, remembers the terror and the resolve and the impossible burden of leading a nation that had no good options, only terrible ones and worse ones, only the choice between fighting with little hope and surrendering to certain darkness. The Arab Spring erupts across the Middle East in 2011, revolutions spreading from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Syria, and someone mentions it to him during a visit, describes the uprisings and the hope and the chaos, and his eyes open briefly, focus on nothing visible in the room, and close again slowly. He has seen revolutions before, has seen people rise up against tyranny and oppression, has seen hope and violence intertwine in ways that end sometimes in freedom and sometimes in new tyrannies worse than the old ones they replaced. He could tell them if he could speak that revolution is easy, but building what comes after is the hard part, that tearing down is simple, but constructing lasting institutions requires wisdom and patience and compromise that revolutionaries rarely possess in their moment of triumph. But he cannot speak, and the words stay locked inside whatever remains of his mind, unshared and useless. The 2016 Brexit referendum shakes Britain to its core in ways not seen since the war years, dividing families and communities and generations. And Winston Churchill, at 141 years old, hears about it in fragments, in pieces of conversation around his bed that he may or may not comprehend. Britain has voted to leave the European Union, to reclaim sovereignty and control over its own affairs, to stand apart from the continent rather than integrated with it. And those who support this decision invoke his name constantly, his legacy, his fierce defence of British independence and parliamentary sovereignty. Those who oppose Brexit also invoke him, arguing that he would have wanted Britain engaged with Europe, leading Europe, not isolated from it, that his vision of Britain was as a great power influencing continental affairs, not withdrawing from them. Both sides claim him with absolute confidence, and he cannot respond, cannot clarify, cannot tell them what he actually thinks, because he may not be capable of thinking anymore in any conventional sense, can only exist as a symbol that everyone interprets according to their own beliefs and desires. The truth, perhaps, is more complex than either side admits or wants to acknowledge. He loved Britain above all else, devoted his entire life to its preservation and greatness, but he also understood that Britain's power and influence came from engagement with the world, from alliance and leadership, from being at the table when decisions were made. He would have strong opinions about Brexit, certainly, passionate views about sovereignty and democracy and the nature of British identity, but what those opinions would actually be, no one can truly know with certainty, because the world of 2016 is so far removed from the world he navigated that comparisons become problematic. His doctors marvel that he still lives, that his body continues functioning at an age no human being has ever reached or even approached, that his cells keep dividing and his organs keep operating decades past any reasonable expectation. They study him with a mixture of scientific fascination and ethical discomfort, write papers about his case in medical journals, speculate about genetic factors or environmental influences or pure chance that might explain his unprecedented longevity. He is simultaneously a patient deserving dignity and care, and an experiment in the limits of human life, and a phenomenon that challenges everything medical science understands about aging and death. Sometimes music plays in his room, classical pieces by composers he loved, Beethoven and Mozart and Elgar, and his fingers twitch slightly in rhythm with the melodies, some deep part of his brain still responding to beauty, still finding patterns in sound even as higher cognitive functions fade into darkness. The nurses notice these small responses and note them in his chart, evidence of something still present inside the shell, some remnant of the person who was Winston Churchill existing beneath the layers of age and decline. The COVID-19 pandemic sweeps across the world in 2020 like a plague from ancient times, and Churchill at 145 years old is isolated completely for his protection, his care team wearing full protective equipment, the world outside locked down in ways he never witnessed even during wartime. No one expects him to survive this, a respiratory illness that kills the elderly with cruel efficiency, that has already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives across the globe and will claim millions more before it ends. But somehow, impossibly, his ancient lungs continue pulling in air and expelling it, continue the basic rhythm of existence that defines life, continue functioning when lungs decades younger are failing. He contracts the virus inevitably despite all precautions, develops a fever and respiratory distress, and for 2 weeks the medical team prepares for the end, for the death that should have come 55 years ago finally arriving. But he recovers slowly, his immune system somehow marshalling a response, and within a month he is back to his baseline state of minimal consciousness and biological persistence. It makes no medical sense, and his doctors can offer no explanation beyond shaking their heads in wonder and continuing their care. The world outside his window transforms during the pandemic lockdowns. Empty streets where traffic used to flow constantly, masked faces where smiles used to be visible, economies frozen, death tolls rising, fear spreading faster than the virus itself. It is a different kind of war, against an invisible enemy that respects no borders or treaties, and he would have understood it viscerally if he were still capable of understanding, would have found the words to rally people and sustain morale through the darkness as he did 80 years before when bombs fell on London. But he is beyond words now, beyond understanding current events, existing in a state between life and death that serves no clear purpose except to demonstrate that biology sometimes defies all logic and expectation. His family cannot visit during the strictest lockdowns, and he is attended only by medical staff who know him only as a patient, not as history incarnate, not as the man who shaped the 20th century. The loneliness of it would be crushing if he were aware enough to feel loneliness, if consciousness remains at a level that experiences emotion. Vaccines arrive with astonishing speed, the product of global scientific cooperation and coordination, and he receives one of the first doses. This man who predates antibiotics and chemotherapy, who lived through medical eras when a simple infection could easily kill. The nurse who administers the injection has no idea who he really is beyond what the chart tells her, knows only that he is very old and very important and must be protected. She gives him the shot with professional efficiency and moves on to the next patient, unaware that she has just vaccinated someone born when Gladstone was Prime Minister. By 2025, Winston Churchill has lived 150 years, an impossible span that encompasses the entire modern age from its birth to its current form. He was born when Victoria ruled an empire on which the sun never set, when horses drew carriages through London streets, when electricity was a novelty confined to laboratories and wealthy homes, when human flight was a fantasy discussed by dreamers. He has lived through the invention of the automobile and the airplane, the radio and the television, the atomic bomb and the computer, the internet and the smartphone. He has seen the world's population grow from 1.5 billion to 8 billion human beings. He has witnessed the rise and fall of empires and ideologies and certainties that seemed eternal. And still he breathes, in and out, in and out, in a medical facility designed specifically to maintain him, though no one is quite sure why anymore, what purpose his continued existence serves beyond itself. His great-great-grandchildren visit sometimes, people who share his DNA but live in a world he would not recognize, who speak in references and technologies and social concepts utterly alien to his experience and understanding. They look at him with a mixture of reverence for who he was and confusion about what he has become, this ancient ancestor who somehow will not die, who bridges generations in ways no family tree was ever meant to bridge. They touch his hand gently and speak to him though he gives no sign of hearing, and they leave feeling unsettled by the encounter, by the reminder that life does not always end cleanly or mercifully. Outside the facility, Britain continues its uncertain journey through the 21st century, navigating climate change that threatens coastlines and weather patterns, artificial intelligence that promises to revolutionize work and life, cultural transformations around identity and values that would have been unimaginable to someone from Churchill's era. His name still appears regularly in debates and discussions, in arguments about leadership and crisis management, about the nature of greatness and the cost of difficult decisions, about how to remember complicated historical figures who did both admirable and condemnable things. He has become a reference point, a touchstone, a symbol interpreted differently by different factions but invoked by all. The doctors explained periodically to his family that they could stop the interventions, cease the medications and the feeding tube and the machines that monitor and support his basic functions, that his quality of life is essentially zero, that he exists in a state of minimal consciousness with no prospect of recovery or improvement. But his advanced directives, written decades ago when he still had full mental capacity, were absolutely clear and unambiguous. All measures to sustain life should be taken, no matter what, no matter how long, no matter the cost or the circumstances. He was never a man who surrendered, never a man who believed in retreat or giving up, and even in this final battle against death itself he remains stubborn and unyielding, forcing life to pry him loose rather than releasing his grip willingly. So the machines continue their work, the medications flow through his veins on schedule, the feeding tube delivers nutrition to a body that has forgotten how to want food or feel hunger. His brain activity shows patterns on monitors, slow waves that indicate some level of awareness or processing. But what he is aware of, what thoughts if any move through that ancient mind, no technology can determine with certainty. Perhaps he dreams eternally of his past, of Clementine young and beautiful in their early years together, of his children when they were small, of the House of Commons in full debate with voices echoing from the benches, of tanks rolling across European battlefields and planes flying overhead and soldiers fighting for causes he articulated in speeches that moved nations. Perhaps he is trapped in memories, reliving moments over and over in an endless loop, unable to escape the prison of his own history, condemned to experience again and again the triumphs and the failures, the moments of glory and the hours of despair. Or perhaps there is a peace in it that outsiders cannot perceive, a letting go of ego and ambition and the need to shape events, a floating in the simple fact of existence without the burden of agency or responsibility. Perhaps he is finally free of being Winston Churchill with all that entails, finally released from the weight of his own legend and reputation, existing in some state of pure being that needs no thoughts or words or actions. His paintings hang in galleries and museums now, displayed alongside works by professional artists, his amateur efforts taken seriously because of whose hand held the brush, because each brushstroke connects to history. His books line library shelves in multiple languages, his histories and memoirs and volumes of speeches read by students and scholars trying to understand the 20th century and the man who helped shape its course. And somewhere in London, in a private medical facility behind locked doors and professional security, kept alive by the miracles of modern medicine and the stubbornness of his own biology, the man who created all of it continues his impossible persistence into an age that has no framework for him. The 21st century accelerates into territories he could never have imagined even in his most visionary moments. Artificial intelligence begins to reshape society in fundamental ways. Autonomous systems making decisions once reserved for human judgment, machines learning and adapting and performing tasks that required human intelligence when Churchill was young. Climate change, which he would have understood as a scientific challenge requiring coordinated international response, dominates global discourse and policy debates. New powers rise to challenge the old order. China becomes an economic superpower and technological rival to America. India grows into a massive democratic force with a population exceeding 1 billion. Africa begins to emerge from centuries of exploitation and underdevelopment. The world order that he helped establish after World War II strains and fractures under pressures he did not foresee, and people debate whether that order should be preserved or replaced with something better suited to current realities. And through it all, in a quiet room in London, a heart keeps beating that was born in the reign of Queen Victoria, that has pumped blood through the same body for more than 15 decades. What would he make of it if he could see and understand? This world where British power is greatly diminished but British influence persists in language and law and culture, where democracy has spread to most of the world but struggles everywhere with populism and polarization, where technology has created abundance and opportunity and new forms of suffering and control, where his warnings about tyranny remain relevant even as the tyrants change their names and ideologies and methods. No one can ask him these questions. No one will ever know his true thoughts about the future he has lived into but cannot truly participate in or comprehend. He has become a mirror in which people see their own beliefs and values reflected back at them, a historical figure so thoroughly documented and studied that everyone can find evidence for their particular interpretation, so complex and contradictory that no single narrative can capture the full truth of who he was. Hero and villain, savior and imperialist, visionary and reactionary, brilliant orator and stubborn defender of empire, champion of democracy and paternalistic administrator of colonies, he was all of these things at different moments and sometimes simultaneously, and his impossible survival into the 21st century does not resolve these contradictions, only extends them into an era that has no framework for understanding him except through the lens of contemporary values that did not exist in his lifetime. Somewhere in his mind, if mind is still the right word for what remains, perhaps there are fragments floating in the darkness. The smell of cigar smoke curling in a study, the taste of champagne bubbles on the tongue, the weight of responsibility sitting heavy in the war rooms beneath London, the soft touch of Clementine's hand on his shoulder, the sound of bombs falling in the distance during the Blitz, the roar of Parliament in heated debate echoing from stone walls, the satisfaction of finding exactly the right word for a speech. Perhaps these fragments play and replay like a film loop that never ends, an endless repetition of sensation and memory untethered from time or sequence or meaning. Perhaps there is only darkness and nothing, the biological persistence of a body whose consciousness has long since departed or dissolved into something unrecognizable. Perhaps there is something in between these extremes, some twilight state that neuroscience cannot yet measure or understand, some form of minimal awareness that experiences existence without thought or emotion or intention. Medical ethicists write papers and hold conferences about his case, about the philosophical and practical implications of keeping someone alive so far beyond any reasonable expectation, about where the line falls between life and mere biological function, about whether his advanced directives written in an earlier era should bind caregivers in circumstances he could never have anticipated, about the resources devoted to maintaining one person who contributes nothing and experiences nothing that anyone can verify. But the law is clear on the subject. and medical professionals are bound by law and ethics to respect his written wishes, and so he is maintained with meticulous care, and the questions remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. His legend grows paradoxically stronger as his body grows weaker, each year that passes adding to the mythic quality of his existence. He becomes Churchill in capital letters and bold type, an idea more than a person, a reference point in debates about leadership and courage and the nature of greatness that tells us more about the present than about the past, that reveals more about what people value now than about what Churchill actually did or believed then. The nurses who tend to him change regularly as careers progress and new staff are hired. Young people starting their careers in medicine who were born decades after his supposed death. For them he is simply a very old patient, a case study in extreme longevity, a body to be turned regularly to prevent bed sores and cleaned and monitored for any changes in vital signs. They do not think consciously about Dunkirk or D-Day, about the speeches that saved a nation's morale, about the paintings that brought him peace, about the books he wrote or the policies he shaped. They check the ventilator settings and adjust the feeding tube, and note his vital signs in electronic charts that will be reviewed by doctors who also did not live through the war years, who know Churchill primarily from history books and films and documentaries, who understand his importance intellectually without feeling it emotionally. And this is as it should be in some sense. The world moves on and must move on, cannot remain forever anchored in the past no matter how momentous that past was or how significant its figures. New crises emerge constantly that demand new responses from new leaders, new challenges that require fresh thinking rather than constant reference to earlier examples. Churchill's example remains valuable certainly, preserved in archives and libraries and institutional memory, in the buildings and foundations and awards that bear his name, in the lessons drawn from his successes and failures. But the man himself, the actual breathing body that once contained that ferocious will and brilliant mind and stubborn courage, is fading into a biological technicality, kept alive by machines and medications and professional protocols, but no longer participating in the life he is technically still living. If there is mercy in the universe, perhaps it lies in the possibility that he is unaware of this prolonged ending, that wherever his consciousness resides, if it resides anywhere at all, it is not trapped in the present but back in moments of triumph and love, not suffering this endless medical suspension, but experiencing memories of better times. Perhaps he walks eternally through gardens with Clementine in the summer of their engagement, young and in love and full of hope for the future. Perhaps he stands forever at the dispatch box in Parliament, feeling the power of his words moving his colleagues, knowing he has found the phrase that will define the moment. Perhaps he paints endlessly at his easel in the Mediterranean sun, capturing light and color without concern for politics or war or history. Or perhaps there is nothing, no awareness at all, just the mechanical continuation of biological processes without any experiencer to observe them, which might be its own form of mercy. And so we arrive at now, at this moment, at the question that cannot be answered with any certainty: when does Winston Churchill's story truly end? He breathes still as of this moment, 151 years old, his body maintained in a state that biology never intended and evolution never planned for, his presence in the world reduced to a line on a medical chart and a name that appears in ongoing debates about medical ethics and historical legacy and the nature of life itself. The world continues its chaotic and accelerating evolution around him. New technologies emerge monthly that would seem like magic to earlier generations. Old certainties crumble as social and political structures adapt to changing realities. Humanity stumbles forward through crises of its own making and random catastrophes that respect no human plan or preparation. Britain navigates its post-Brexit reality, trying to define its role and identity in a world where it is no longer the dominant power it once was. The European Union adapts to new challenges and internal tensions. America wrestles with polarization and its role in a multipolar world. And in a quiet room in London, a heart beats that has been beating since the 19th century, that has witnessed more change than any human heart was ever meant to witness. There is no ending here in any traditional sense, only continuation, the same relentless continuation that defines all of existence, the forward movement of time that cares nothing for individuals no matter how significant their accomplishments, that sweeps empires into dust and raises new civilizations from ruins, that makes heroes into history and history into myth and myth into half-remembered stories. Winston Churchill, who rallied the free world against fascist darkness, who shaped the 20th century through words and will, an unyielding determination and stubborn refusal to accept defeat, is now simply a very old man who will not die, who exists in some liminal space between life and death, waiting perhaps for whatever comes next if anything comes, if waiting implies an awareness he may no longer possess. His legacy is secure in terms of accomplishment if contested in terms of interpretation, praised by some and condemned by others depending on which aspects of his life they choose to emphasize. His words endure in the English language and in the speeches still quoted when people need inspiration or guidance. His example remains available for those who seek it, both the positive examples of courage and leadership and the negative examples of imperial thinking and racial prejudice. And his body persists beyond all reason or explanation, a final act of defiance against the universe itself, refusing to surrender even when surrender is the only rational choice, stubborn to the very end and beyond the end and far beyond any reasonable limit, into a future that unfolds without him even as he continues to exist within it, a paradox and an impossibility and an absurdity. A man who lived through 3 centuries in ways both literal and figurative, whose story even now at this late hour refuses to find its conclusion, but instead fades slowly into the ongoing river of time that carries all of us toward destinations we cannot see and endings we cannot escape, except, perhaps, when we somehow do escape them through sheer stubbornness or biological accident or forces beyond anyone's understanding. When the impossible becomes merely improbable and then somehow becomes real against all odds and expectations. When history bends just enough to let one man who shaped the world watch that world continue spinning and evolving long after his time should have passed, bearing silent witness to changes he helped create and changes he could never have foreseen, voiceless now but still present in some undefinable way, still here in the most basic biological sense, still breathing in and out and in and out and in and out in that eternal rhythm that defines the boundary between existence and non-existence, continuing forward into days and weeks and months and years that stretch ahead into a future no one can predict, least of all the man who exists at the center of it all, unknowing and unknown, remembered and forgotten, present and absent, alive and not alive, Winston Churchill eternal and ending and never quite finished, his story unfolding still in this strange twilight that has no precedent and no conclusion.